Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We have the very rare delight and honor to have with us today Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland. Dr. Brundtland has received the first ever Tang Prize on Sustainable Development yesterday because she has arguably done more than anyone else to advance the cause of sustainable development over the past 30 years. For this and much more, it is not exaggeration to say that she has been one of the most important world leaders of the past decades. It is no accident that when Nelson Mandela formed a group of the world's most distinguished leaders called the Elders, Dr. Brundtland was among the chosen few, and she's now serving as the vice chair of the Elders. Almost everything the world is doing today on sustainable development and climate change can be traced back to something she started or helped to start. The UN Climate Convention, the Sustainable Development Summit, and many, many efforts and campaigns around the world. In the past few years, I've been traveling the world to promote action on sustainable development and transformation, especially as the president of the International Council for Science. You can say that I have been following the example and inspiration of Dr. Brundtland. My colleagues and I are all big admirers of her vision and leadership. And now we have the rare opportunity to see and listen to this visionary leader in person. She speaks to us at an especially important time. The world is still heading in the wrong direction toward 4 degrees Celsius of warming instead of the 2 degrees that scientists say is the threshold of danger. Back in 1987, Dr. Brundtland laid out a vision and approach to sustainable development, and she has urged the world to follow it ever since. Sadly, the world is still moving too slowly, too stuck in all unsustainable ways of development, and time is running out on us. All this matters a lot for Taiwan. More than you could imagine, the way Taiwan is developing is far from being sustainable. Having one of the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world, climate change is also very bad news for Taiwan. Weather disasters will get worse. Sea levels will continue to rise. Agriculture production probably will fall. And resources will get more expensive. Taiwan is highly vulnerable on all these fronts. If we do not work hard with the people in the rest of the world, life will be very unpleasant on this little island of ours. So let us listen very, very carefully to what Dr. Brundtland has to say. There's lots of wisdom in her words, as I learned in the past 3 days. For the younger people here today, I especially hope that you will listen carefully to Dr. Brundtland as my generation moves on. You are inheriting a world with many unsolved challenges, but also many opportunities. What this world and Taiwan are to become will come down to the choices you make. You will do well to follow the example of Dr. Brundtland I think it is often said, behind a great man, there was always a more tremendous lady behind. For the equity for gender, I would like to say the same thing, if Gro will agree with me. But I would like to introduce Mr. Brundtland, who has been with us today. Mr. Brundtland. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you to Dr. Lee. Now, I can tell you that the news about receiving this prestigious prize came as a complete surprise in early June. I certainly share the views expressed by the Honorable Dr. Samuel Yin when he announced these new prizes, that the world was a very different place than more than a century ago when the Nobel Prizes were established. He made the point that we now need to reflect the new challenges faced by humanity: climate change, energy shortages, emerging diseases, clashes of cultures and ideas, and shifting world orders. I will today try to convey the story of my life and concerns, and how they led me to try to contribute to address a number of these challenges, including the rule of law, human rights, and the empowerment and rights of women and girls. My life has been dominated by a series of daunting challenges. It has also been a continuous journey of learning, seeking evidence, and inspiring change and innovation, based on a commitment to promoting justice, equal rights, and opportunities for all. Born in a small, well, not small in size, but small in population, as you know, equitable, democratic, and increasingly prosperous country, I was one of the lucky ones of this world. I had parents with deep convictions and was raised to believe in a society based on shared values and on solidarity. I became a doctor, a public health specialist, a wife and a mother of 4, then a politician, a responsibility that dominated my life for the next 3 decades, nationally and internationally, until I combined my original profession and leadership experience in becoming the first woman to head the World Health Organization. Today, 10 years after, I am an elder, as you heard, initiated by Nelson Mandela, serving with a group of experienced and independent leaders to promote peace and human rights, seeking to overcome conflict and contribute to solutions to seemingly intractable problems. I am happy to serve in this capacity with friends and colleagues, such as Kofi Annan, our chair, Mary Robinson, Jimmy Carter, Marty Ahtisaari, Enrique Cardoso, among others. We are 11 altogether now. Half a century ago, in the mid-60s, I returned from a postgraduate year at Harvard School of Public Health, a young doctor of only 25, My medical degree had been from Oslo. Now I had become Master of Public Health and ready to enter public service. As I chose to become a doctor, my perspective was to be able to make a difference in helping pursue health and human rights, a fair and just society, improving opportunities for all, not least for women. So my dream was not to be a surgeon, it was to deal with society. It was clear to me that girls were discriminated against, in school as well as in family and working life, even in Norway, a socially well-advanced and democratic country. This was wrong and unfair. I felt a strong urge to try to make a difference. Now, how could it come about that this young doctor ended up as a recipient of a new prize on sustainable development 50 years later? Well, indeed, it all started when the Norwegian Prime Minister took a bold decision to ask this young public health professional and publicly outspoken young lady to enter his government, not as Minister of Health, but as Minister of the Environment. I can tell you I was stunned. But I was also convinced that I had to take the challenge. How could I decline, even with 4 young children, having argued so consistently for more participation in working life and the political arena for women as well as men? Now I experienced a steep curve of increased obligations, challenges and opportunities as I became known in Norway and internationally, taking new initiatives and succeeding in promoting some change for the environment as well as for the equality of women. I soon became deputy leader of my party, the Labour Party, a parliamentarian, then party leader and prime minister. I had seen early on in my new role as environment minister that I could benefit from my own background in medical and public health training. After all, our biggest concern for the environment is about the health of people, even though we now fully need to realize how dependent we all have become on the health of our planet. I have always insisted on building on evidence and on research-based conclusions, ever since my basic education as a medical doctor, then reconfirmed during my year at Harvard. It influenced my role also as a politician. And I believe this helped create increased confidence and credibility within my party, in Norway, and across countries as I spoke out on different issues. Remember, in Stockholm in 1972, this was 2 years before I even became environment minister, at the first global UN meeting on the environment, Indira Gandhi, the most forceful voice from the G77, had said the famous words, "Poverty is the greatest polluter." It certainly set the stage. She was right. Clearly, a key concern for human development must be eradication of abject poverty and meeting the needs and rights of every human being for dignity, for real choices, and a decent life. When I was asked more than a decade later to establish and lead a new independent commission, I was profoundly aware that there was no alternative road ahead but to confront the two main challenges, environment and development, in an integrated manner. I was also determined we must picture our real world not be dominated by the West and the North. We were, in fact, asked to address major global challenges, threats to the environment and to natural resources, increasing population pressure, poverty, and lack of development. In asking me to take on this seemingly impossible and enormous task, the World Commission on Environment and Development, that we called it, the Secretary General reminded me, you are the only environment minister to have become Prime Minister. And again, I knew I had to take the challenge. We saw scandals and catastrophes. Bhopal, Basel, 3 Mile Island, and later Chernobyl. An enormous new challenge was upon us all, the risk of permanent damage to our environment and to planet Earth. The issue of environmental destruction and sustainability was, however, seen by developing countries as a concern limited to rich countries, whom they felt were overlooking the vast poverty and lack of development in large parts of the world. Indeed, it is correct to conclude that human development is a major contribution, even to the achievement of sustainability and taking care of the environment. So is the realization that freeing women from discrimination to be full participants in all societies must be a major goal, not just in terms of human rights, but also to achieve economic success. Over and above the concrete incidents and frightening trends, we face the issue of just and equitable distribution and of burden sharing. On the Commission, I put together, having selected more than half the members coming from developing countries, we analyzed, and that was a first on the global scene. It was never before a balance like that. We analyzed all the basic links, as well as raised the new dimensions of intergenerational responsibility. In our report, we called for equitable growth, one that is forceful and at the same time socially and environmentally sustainable. What really matters is the quality of growth, both in terms of promoting growth that benefit the poor, but also in terms of reducing the impact on the environment. And this, of course, is what today is often referred to as the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. Our approach was to link firm evidence with a clarion call for action. We addressed the dangerous trends towards climate change and global warming as a major challenge to the international community and to our common future. This was, in fact, dramatic enough for the world to be able to agree only 5 years later in Rio, agreed to the Climate Convention and to other things. As we are all aware, however, the world has been much too slow in seriously to respond to the clear and mounting evidence before us. However, I still want to share with you some optimistic signs, and which means an opportunity. More than 2.3 billion people have gained access to better drinking water. More than 3 million lives have been saved through nets against malaria and mosquitoes. 90% of those lives saved are children. So there is also generally a greater consensus today around what it is that works. A pragmatic approach, realizing that good governance and well-functioning state is necessary to support a flourishing market economy within established rules of law and basic social context. South Korea, Singapore, China and Brazil, Turkey and Ethiopia have all experienced very positive trends through state and market combined, social investment and a better distribution of wealth. The recent Human Development Report analyzes the importance of universal provision of basic social services to enhance resilience and concludes that such measures are achievable by countries at all stages of development. It points to the fact that it is not only something that has been experienced by countries like the Nordic, but by countries such as South Korea and Costa Rica as well. They both started their process of social insurance when their GDP was lower than that of India and Pakistan today. So there is no need to wait for a more effective, progressive policy in any country of the world. Today, on climate and energy, the same urgent challenges are still with us. While global leaders struggle to agree on a path ahead that is realistic, just, and equitable. The situation illustrates the urgency of the matter. The world is at present moving towards a 2 degrees Celsius scenario, not the 4 degree, not the 2 degree one that our leaders committed to in Copenhagen in 2009. Poor countries and emerging economies are already responsible for 2/3 of global emissions. This needs to be understood. It's not going to help to point fingers to the US and Europe and say, you solve the problem. There is too small a share of the problem remaining on that part. So more than 2/3, and now it will, that fraction, 2/3, will increase year by year in the coming decades. Poor countries, yes, now that process that was set in motion from 92 and from 87 by my report, 92 in Rio, is, however, still active and working. Rio +20, which was nearly 2 years ago, tried to take stock of the progress since the Earth Summit and to move us toward a green economy. So while the world has improved, and that stock taking showed us that the world has improved in some areas, such as in some of the poverty and development areas that I mentioned a couple of, the gradual healing also in environmental terms of the ozone layer, and the number of people who have been lifted out of abject poverty, the vision of sustainable development at a global scale still remains unmet. In particular, environmental degradation continues and is in some cases accelerating. We now urgently need to step up the pace of change. The Secretary General has made sustainable development a top priority for his second 5-year term. His high-level panel on global sustainability, on which I had the honor to serve, presented our report in the run-up to Rio about 2 years ago. And we made clear that the current global development model is unsustainable. We can no longer assume that our collective actions will not trigger tipping points as environmental thresholds are breached, risking irreversible damage to both ecosystems and to human communities. We all need to recognize that the drivers of that challenge include unsustainable lifestyles, production and consumption patterns, and the impact of population growth. As the global population grows from 7 billion to 9 billion by 2040, with the emergence of 3 billion new middle-class consumers over the next 20 years, the demand for resources will rise exponentially. By 2030, the world will need at least 50% more food, 45% more energy, and 30% more water. Our panel strongly emphasized a critical point for our common future: the need to always measure and to price what matters. The marketplace has to reflect the full ecological and human costs of economic decisions and establish price signals that make transparent the consequences not only of action, but the consequences of inaction. And this means pollution, including carbon emissions, can no longer be free. Subsidies should be made transparent and phased out for fossil fuels by 2020. We must build new ways to measure development beyond GDP. Ironically, as I went through this with my fellow commissioners on the Secretary General's panel, I realized that ironically, these words are word for word nearly the recommendations we made in 1987 by the World Commission. Also then, we pointed to the need for science to allow for a more informed and integrated decision-making. This is essential for decision makers to share the basic knowledge upon which to act. The debate about human activities and global warming should now be behind us, as the evidence is even stronger in the last IPCC report. Effects of climate change are already occurring on all continents and across the oceans, from the tropics to the poles, from small islands to large continents, from the poorest to the wealthiest countries. Climate change is affecting agriculture, water resources, human health, and ecosystems on land and in the oceans. It poses immense risks for economic stability and the security of nations. And this is why it is essential that governments complete their work on a new universal climate agreement in 2015. As I mentioned yesterday, more and more we need to acknowledge that even real solid facts and evidence are not sufficient for a multicultural and diverse world to act effectively on behalf of humanity and our planet. Nations are still thinking on a national, not a global basis. We need even more emphasis on building common understanding among individuals across all national borders. And as young people, through social media, are accessing knowledge and reality on many issues affecting their future lives and their security, I believe the basis for popular pressure and demand for consolidated action can be even more strongly built. Now, when I was Minister of the Environment back in the 1970s, 40 years ago, we faced the horrendous threat of dying forests and lakes in Europe due to acidification. We were discussing acid rain, a term that luckily is less in use today due to effective measures that have been put in place. The diplomatic challenge was that the sources of pollution were found in some countries and the effects were felt in others. In the 1980s, we managed to adopt a treaty that established the duty of all parties to cut SO2 emissions by 30%. This was the equal percentage reduction approach. Other challenges soon made it clear that that approach would imply a punishment for those countries and businesses that had already reduced their emissions at the cost of reductions beyond a certain baseline, were much higher for those who already had implemented cuts and installed new technologies. Politically, the breakthrough was driven by a new awareness, in particular in Europe. It was part of a larger global awakening and a growing and spreading fear that environmental problems were about to spin out of control. I'm telling you this story because we have solved some problems together. In Norway, as I again became Prime Minister in 1990, after a one-year break, my government introduced a considerable carbon tax, not only on the mainland, Norway, but also on the Norwegian continental shelf. There was an outcry, not just in the oil industry of Norway, but from leaders of oil exporting countries across the world. I knew there was no other way than putting a price on all sources of emissions, even when oil-producing countries were arguing the exact opposite. You know what they said when they came to Rio? Please compensate us for the effect of new environmental policies on the value of our key national asset. That is the opposite of what was necessary. The face of the earth replaced the annual Man and Woman of the Year in Time magazine. You can realize that the earth was proclaimed Planet of the Year. Few years later, CNN televised the first Earth Summit in Rio in '92. So things were being seen, observed, and people took notice. The Berlin Wall had come down in 1989. Everything seemed possible. A global campaign for environment and development gathered momentum, and all world leaders, more or less, gathered in Rio in '92. There, the Climate Convention, as I said, was adopted, the Certification Convention, the Biodiversity Convention. Likewise, and together with the large Agenda 21, global business was on their toes, licenses to operate at stake. Even finance began paying attention. But the political '90s did not end in Rio. We saw a sequence of global UN conferences. In Cairo '94, we dealt with the issues of population and development, or in plain language, with the issues of people and resources, and with the right to choose the number and the spacing of one's children. In Beijing in '95, the World Conference on Women dealt with the rights and opportunities of half of humanity and the benefits of that to all of humanity. In Copenhagen earlier that same year, at the social summit all countries met to deal with the relationship between the state and its citizens. I went to all of these conferences. They were all important. Then in Kyoto in 1997, as you know, we adopted the most complex and forward-looking instrument ever to see the light of day, an instrument that would have taken us a long way towards actually preventing climate change if all countries had been part of it. During this decade of optimism, the 90s, of democracy on the move forward, and a United States that was willing to lead in global affairs under the leadership of Bill Clinton and Al Gore, solutions did seem possible. But, you know, the 90s in many ways ended 9/11. Important processes lost a great deal of traction. Later, the revival so many of us were hoping for got stuck in the financial crisis of 2008 and the following years. I believe we can conclude nothing moves fast enough or strongly enough if the USA is not one of the driving forces. It is also true very little of any consequence will happen if China, India, and other important emerging economies do not engage for results. Now, fortunately, there are several good signs of large and emerging economies like China taking important action to promote public health, a cleaner use of energy, and efforts to reduce dangerous emissions. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard about the Green Fund. It has been a slow process, I can tell you, under the Climate Convention. It has far too long been experiencing the risk of being left unimportant and ineffective by countries imposing ineffective procedures on it. However, now, finally, there is some good news. Some smaller countries, such as Norway, and I know others, has announced they will be contributing to the fund, which means they have accepted that this is going to be a working, positive instrument, which we need. And the signals from Germany are the same. So there is real hope that other large countries, hopefully not only the US, but also China, will be a partner in this critical context for the success of global action on climate. Increasingly, action is being taken and policies put in place on a national basis. So countries are now more willing also to be counted as they report on their own plans and actions. Many now recognize that limited public funds must be used strategically so that they can be incentives to unlock greater private investment flows, share risks, and expand access to the building blocks of prosperity, including modern energy services. This means taking advantage of the vast potential that lies in maximization of resource productivity, especially with respect to energy and to water, and reducing waste. It means investing in sustainable technologies that will create jobs and support the poor, that will improve health and education, and build more resilient and equitable societies. Today, we don't only, most of us, believe it is a fundamental human value and a right that the role of women is essential and must be promoted. Women are now increasingly being acknowledged as a vital force for growth and for sustainable development, not just a human rights issue. We have the knowledge, the data now, and the experience to prove that those who remain stuck in patriarchal patterns of economic life will lose and lose badly. That everything is connected to everything else is clearly true for the world of energy and climate. This is a notion that I have expressed at one time in the Norwegian Parliament in a question time. Yes, I said, a little frustrated by not so good questions from an opposition leader. I said, yes, indeed, everything is connected to everything else. And that's how it is. So now, when you look at climate and energy, you certainly understand that. Countries, as we face this great challenge of climate change, we also face the economic opportunity and the trends towards a global transition to sustainable energy. It is an optimistic sign that renewable prices are going down. Volumes of new investment are impressing, not least in the emerging markets. But the presence of a seeming abundance of inexpensive, relatively speaking, inexpensive fossil fuels threaten to undercut our efforts to stabilize the global climate. So, as the world struggles to get on the same page with regard to responsibility for action, and in spite of the increase in demand, prices for turbines and solar panels have been falling, making these solutions both more affordable and more competitive. Now, it means business needs, and they call for much more government action to inspire innovation and the solutions to reach a sustainable world. We know that public policies are needed. They know too. Public policies are needed to stimulate markets, to remove barriers, to level the playing field, and establish clear objectives and targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency. At the same time, we need to undo old-fashioned policies that create the wrong incentives and keep us locked in unsustainable ways of doing business. I know now that you have some of this even here in beautiful Taiwan. Some not so good policies which have to do with fossil fuel subsidies, for instance. So things can change, however. A good example is fossil fuel subsidies, about the wrong incentives, which still exist in many countries. In fact, annual subsidies for established fossil fuels are estimated to cost around $500 billion worldwide, depending on the oil price. India, and it's unbelievable, India is today using 14% of its federal budget for subsidies of gasoline prices. $43 billion. These are resources that could be channeled to clean, low-cost sustainable energy and technologies, as well as to social programs to benefit the poor. And that's what they need. To ensure that vulnerable groups are not hurt as subsidies recede, we can look to countries like Indonesia that have implemented poverty alleviation programs and social protection programs in combination with subsidy reforms. I'm sure you know that the Secretary General has made energy, sustainable energy, a core priority of his second term, as well as sustainable development. And increasing parts of the international institutional capacity that we have is being geared toward that goal. What the Secretary General has expressed his intention in this way. Energy is the golden thread that connects development, social inclusion, and environmental protection. Well said. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, an estimated 200,000 health clinics lack electricity, and women give birth at night beneath dim and dirty kerosene lamps. Addressing such an energy gap is an example of a particularly ripe target for an innovative blend of philanthropy, investment, and government support. It is hard to believe, in fact, that a decade into or more into the 21st century, exposure to indoor air pollution from the use of wood, dung, and coal for cooking and home heating is still one of the world's largest public health problems. Yet 2.7 billion people lack these fuels. They use these fuels, and more than 1 billion people have no access to electricity. Globally, the good news, however, is, as I said, the production and deployment of renewable energy is gaining a lot of speed. In the last couple of years, we have heard increasing calls for fossil fuel divestment. Not least in universities, this has been a debate, it's an ongoing debate. Not least the divesting in the case of coal, not only for environmental reasons, but based on the investment risks involved as we look into the future. Coal assets are threatened by attractive sources of renewable energy, which are already penetrating into the market. Regulatory measures are also curbing the demand for coal. Stricter environmental controls across the globe have resulted in a rising number of coal plants retiring early, as they also have inhibited the feasibility of opening new ones. Asia's energy needs will double over the next 20 years. This certainly illustrates the fundamental need to decouple this new era of growth from growth in CO2 emissions, while ensuring universal access to sustainable energy. Today, there is increasing awareness of the urgency of putting a real price on carbon. Continuing our traditional system of free riders has to stop. It is unacceptable and unsustainable that producers and consumers do not pay for or account for the real cost of burning fossil fuels. Governments are, however, in fact taking action. So I am not giving you a completely pessimistic picture here. In 2014, about 40 national and more than 20 subnational jurisdictions have already implemented or scheduled emission trading systems or carbon taxes, accounting for more than 22% of global emissions. So it's not only Norway back in 1990 already, but now 2014, we have altogether 60 jurisdictions that are doing something. Together, they represent almost half than of the global GHG global emissions. Business now, increasingly, as I mentioned, they are aware of the trends. And they are aware that carbon pricing is the most efficient and cost-effective means of reducing emissions, leading them to voice their support for carbon pricing. Progressive businesses across the world are voicing these concerns and asking for action. It also means we must urgently turn around the widespread paradoxical policies of subsidies for fossil fuels that I mentioned, and imagine the critical need for change when you realize that subsidies for fossil fuels are 6 times higher globally than those that are directed towards renewable energy. I mean, imagine 6 times higher subsidies to fossil fuels than to renewable energy. Well, you know, if you turn that the other way around, well, we will have a major win. The IMF has illustrated that abolishing fossil fuel subsidy policy would reduce global emissions by around 13%. That's about the same as the importance of tropical rainforests across the world. So it's a major thing. It places these efforts on that level of protecting tropical forests and planting trees, which is a contribution to lowering emissions of the same size. The IAEA has also shown that elimination of subsidies for fossil fuels are one of 4 climate actions that do not reduce economic growth. So why on earth it is not happening more? You ask yourself the question in this country, and everyone else that have this problem should do the same. Due to the large present gap of at least 6 billion ton CO2 equivalents between the global ambitions for reductions by 2020 and the reality, this is a high priority contribution. I am often asked about the policies in Norway on climate, oil and gas production, regulations from an environmental perspective, and the experiences we have gained over the last more than 40 years. This, of course, covers more than the 20 years when I was Minister of the Environment, leader in Parliament in the opposition, and then more than 10 years Prime Minister. Norway is proud, across party lines, about the policies that have carried a stable majority during different government regimes and kept the Norwegian continental shelf both an attractive and competitive one, even as stringent regulations have been put in place for environmental security and increasingly due to climate challenge. A recent report from the IHS, a respected international rating institution, ranks Norway as the 7th most attractive among 207 petroleum provinces globally, and as number 2 among the most relevant 80 of these. Even though, as the report expresses, Norway has the strictest climate policy and the 3rd toughest taxation regime. Now let me quote, because this, I mean, it's important to understand that policies can change the situation. And it doesn't have to be in any way detrimental to other important goals. Norway has the world's most advanced climate policy. It is also effective. Norway's CO2 tax is the highest in the world. The Social Democratic government that was in office over the last 8 years, before a conservative government took over a year ago, doubled the level of the CO2 tax. Countries that follow the list on the issue of climate policy are Great Britain, Denmark, Netherlands, while, and notice this, they are all European, they are following, although not as, I mean, close up to Norway with a good climate policy, while US, Mexico, China, and Brazil only score about half the level of Norway on this ranking. So what does that mean? Well, certainly there is a great potential for improvement in many parts of the world, including on this continent. The other question I'm always frequently asked is, and that's my final point now, why 20 years after Rio are we not succeeding in changing our ways and building a sustainable future? Is the reason political, social, or technical? Well, it is all three. We are facing a challenge larger than our present system of governance are able to adequately address and act upon. This is the case in the majority of countries around the world, but above all, it is our still too limited capacity for global governance that are keeping us back. Still, there are several signs of hope. When the Chinese reduce their dependence on coal and oil, that makes perfect sense from an economic risk management perspective. The same goes for the USA. Fiscal measures that will reduce the use of fossil fuels will make sense economically if the carrot and sticks are wisely applied. And as we speak, several countries and regions are voluntarily applying mitigating measures such as taxation and cap and trade. South Korea, Mexico, some 7 regions in China, Japan, California, Quebec, and many others. But partnerships will be crucial. The traditional separation between the public and private sector is becoming increasingly irrelevant as our societies realize how interdependent we all are. In a world with mounting common challenges and threats, not just the public and voluntary sectors, but also the business community must be socially and globally responsible. We will all benefit from the many large and small decisions taken by businesses and companies who look beyond the short-term perspective as they choose investments and solutions for the future. These are the actors and the innovators we will see succeed. These will prove to be the heroes of the younger generations. I remain optimistic. Advances in science have given us a better understanding of climate and ecosystem risks. Billions of people, even in developing countries, are socially connected by technologies that have shrunk the world and expanded the notion of a global neighborhood. Reserving prosperity and security for a few, even if that were morally acceptable, simply is not possible. As long as we all live on the same planet, we will have to make it happen for all of us, or it will not happen at all. I believe we can do it because there is no alternative path ahead to choose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brundtland, for the fantastic sharing. Let's again welcome Dr. Li Yuanzhe to give us an ending remark.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Brundtland for giving us such a wonderful lecture. You gave us so much food for thought. We have to digest in the next couple of weeks, couple of months. I would like to make some remarks about sustainable development. I will not attempt to summarize what you said, but I do want to make comment on the political, social, and technical point. You have been working so hard in fully understanding that the sustainable development issue is a global issue, and we have to work together. At the present time, we are creating our own enemy. And if you ask me, are you optimistic? I said, if you are optimistic, I don't have the right to be pessimistic. would have to be very frank with you. If at the end of next year, 2015, in COP21, if we come up with some global agreement to reduce carbon dioxide, then I will be very optimistic. On the other hand, since we are creating our enemy ourselves, so 10 years from now, people will realize that our defense budget, what we are defending is our common enemy, that's the climate change. So we're spending trillions of dollars trying to defend people from across the border, and that will not be the real enemy. Real enemy will come from ourselves and sustainable development. So I would echo what Dr. Brundtland said, green fund. We have to transfer much of the defense budget into green fund, then things will move along well. Well, as to the social aspect, it is interesting, as we observe, our Earth system is not in good order. Human activity, because of the population and overconsumption, we are overloading the Earth. So as its entirety, we said human society is overdeveloped, and that will not go along very well with my friend in the States or my friend from Africa. People in the United States said, Professor Lee, although we are overdeveloped, we can become sustainable. The people in Africa said, Professor Lee, don't say that we are overdeveloped. We are miserable. We need to develop. We need to develop. I agree that they need to develop, but how are they going to develop? That's the important question. I think if my friend in the States were to confess that, yes, the pattern of consumption, creation and consumption is overloading, and we are not the example to follow. Then people in Africa and Asia would say that, wait a minute, how should we develop? People in Taiwan, are we overdeveloped? Are we overloading the Earth? I think most of us scientists would say, yes, certainly. By emitting almost 11.4 tons of carbon dioxide per capita per year, Taiwan is way overdeveloped. So that development really need to examine more carefully. I've been flying all over Asia, and they all have the dream to develop. But I said we have to develop a different way than what U.S. has developed in the past. For example, in China, in the past 3 years, they used cement the amount the United States spent in whole century. And yet, they are still developing. We are still developing. Asia is trying to develop. And that's not sustainable. So it is important that our sustainable development, our transformation, has to find a different way for Asia and Africa. So don't say that the per capita income is only one half the United States. We have to catch up. We have to really transform very differently. The third will be technical. By 2050, if human society becomes sustainable, I am quite sure at that time our energy sources will all mostly come from sunshine. Sun providing us with enough energy. And as Professor Dr. Brundtland has said, we are getting pretty good at it by using solar energy, like photovoltaic. Within the next 10 years, it will become very inexpensive to use electricity from photovoltaic. But we still face some problems. We can take sunshine and convert it into electricity, but we have not learned enough technically to store the electricity or convert it to something else to transport across the national border. Those are technical aspects we still have to make improvement. Because, as you can see, when we have enough energy from sunshine, my friend in California said, Professor Lee, look, I don't depend on any fossil fuel anymore. Depend on sunshine, photovoltaic, providing me with enough electricity, and I charge up the car. So I'm driving Toyota Leaf, no more CO2 emission. And my former student in San Diego, they challenged me, said, Professor Lee, can you do it? Like myself in California. I said, wait a minute. In the United States, population density is 34 per kilometers. We have 630 per kilometers. Norway is probably around 15 per square kilometers. So we only got 1/20 of the sunshine compared to California, unless you try to convert and export to different country. The sustainability for local people to solve will not be easy. So that's the technical problem we still need to solve. One day, we learn to store the electricity effectively and make it possible to transport across the national border. Then the richest country will be the country who have sunshine. How much sunshine per capita they're receiving will be the richest. So I'm sure at that time, country like Australia will be very rich. There's lots of sunshine, or another country with sunshine will be very rich. As a scientist, I also feel that we have not done as well as we should have. That is about global warming of 2 degrees or 4 degrees. The day before yesterday, Taipei temperature hit 37.5 degrees, highest in history, 37.5. Did it affect any of us? No. Most of us is in the air-conditioned room. 37.5, inside it might be 26 degrees, and when you are in the car, it's again air-conditioned. So climate change, by saying 2 degrees or 4 degrees, most of the people said, so what? I woke up in the morning, by lunchtime, temperature rose for 5 degrees, and in a season, changed by 40 degrees. We failed to communicate that the temperature rise, for example, 1 degree temperature rise, water vapor will increase by 7 tall, and how much energy will be stored in the atmosphere, in fluctuation atmosphere, will bring the extreme weather and might reach the tipping point. Some scientific aspect we have not done well as a scientist. So I also listened to Professor Xiao Chen's Liu's lecture. I always complain that when you talk about extreme weather events, I do not see that most of the people can identify with what you are saying. We have major responsibility to communicate what is happening on Earth. Well, with this note, I'd like to thank again for Professor Brundtland for giving us such a wonderful lecture, stimulate us to work together, work globally to achieve the sustainable development. As we inherited the Earth, which is not too bad, but during our lifetime, I'm talking about 75 years, 75 plus, we really changed the Earth in such a way the young generation are not inheriting healthy Earth. So we have to work hard. I'm, again, very optimistic, just like Professor Brundtland said, because I'm still willing to work for it, so I don't have the right to be pessimistic. I hope every one of you will be in the same boat. Let's work hard. So the next generation will have a wonderful life in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. 谢谢李远哲博士以及得奖人 Dr. Brundtland 精彩的分享。